Hello and welcome to Cutlery Cavern. Today we're going to be looking at the Swiss Army Ranger by Victorinox, specifically the scissor repair and the dating of this particular knife. Originally this was just going to be a videotape on scissor repair, but the repair itself did not work too well, as this is the first ever attempt for me to change the spring on the scissors, and it basically led to me dropping things and swearing a little bit and everything else, and it just wasn't a pretty picture. So instead, I had to do a little bit of editing and get it down to something that was ready for prime time. And much of the information that you'll get in this video I received out of the Swiss Army Knife Owner's Manual by Michael M. Young, specifically pages 133 through 139, which gives a chronological history of when various things happened with these Swiss Army knives, both Victorinox and Wenger, and that goes all the way up to 2011 when the book was put out. And then also in that book, there's some information on scissors repair on pages 177 and 178. If I had read that earlier, I would have probably been better prepared for changing the scissor spring on my knife, and things would have gone much more smoothly. These were the tools that I was using to change the spring. At the top is a pair of South Bend needle nose pliers that I use for fishing. This is a little torque wrench, which I use as a tapping tool for the to get the spring out. And this is just a Kirkland multi-tool hammer wrench kind of thing, which I use for the tapping. And then at the bottom is obviously the Swiss Army Ranger knife. And what we have here is a picture of the broken spring. Um, Obviously, the knife does not work very well with a broken spring like that. And that's why I got it for so cheap. So I ended up having to tap it out. There we see how it was done. And there is the piece knocked out. And there's the replacement spring. And as you can see, this spring is way too big for that hole. And we'll go into more details about that in the video that will be shown in just a second. And here we have the spring in place, and I'll explain all the details of how I ended up having what I had to do in order to get that spring to fit. Okay, if you see that little hole in the spring, it will not fit in this hole here. This hole is for the earlier single spring that was made out of blued steel, and it's a smaller hole than what you find on the newer Victorinox knives. So it's kind of tricky getting a modern spring to fit in there. And what I started to do first off was I took a pair of needle nose pliers like so, and I ended up taking and bending this thing down as much as I could by squeezing it, and then I also had to take and file it around the edges and stuff to make it even a little bit smaller to finally get it to fit into the hole here. And then in order to get it to seat, you end up holding the knife in this position basically, or the scissors that way. Tape them all down so you don't end up cutting yourself, and then you have to basically seat it with a pair of pliers, and you do that by bending this, seating it, pushing it in a little bit, and then it's going to be sitting crooked, and you take the pliers and you squeeze down as hard as you can. Just keep squeezing until it seats in there a little bit, and then you basically have to get something flush against the back of the scissors, and then tap it in the rest of the way. And what I used to tap it in was a torque bit from this little inexpensive torque driver, and I seated it over it, or placed it right over it, and then I had to tap it down with a hammer, and it was a lot of tap tap tap. And the hammer I used was this inexpensive multi-tool hammer by Kirkland, which is good for little tacks and stuff, and it actually was pretty comfortable doing it. Obviously not the right tool for the job, but tap, tap, tap on this, and needless to say, it didn't even mess them up, which was good. And then once that was seated all the way in there, I have the spring in place, a modern stainless steel spring, replacing the older blue spring. But the scissors work real well, and this spring is in there really tight. It's not going to go anywhere. The trick though is it going to work cutting paper? Obviously it's going to work better than the old one did, because before there was no spring at all. And the answer is yeah, it'll work just like any other pair of scissors would work. So excellent replacement, a little harder than I thought it was going to be. Took about 15 to 20 minutes to get this spring in there, and it's mainly because that hole is just a little bit smaller than it needed to be. But so what started off as a Swiss Army Ranger with a pair of broken scissors that I got online through eBay for about $6 is now a Swiss Army Ranger with working scissors. The only difference is the spring is not the original blued spring, but this knife, as it comes from around the transitional period of 73-74, it had both of those springs available. Matter of fact, I think the stainless steel springs were probably the more common springs in Swiss Army knives at that time. So it's still period correct, even though the spring is not the original spring that was in here. So I'm very happy with the end result. And now I have a fully functional Swiss Army Ranger from 1973, 1974, thereabouts. So very happy, really good knife. And I've got that saw blade that I've always wanted, which actually also doubles as a file, so you can file if you want to, and you've got your metal saw. So really good knife to have on hand. Okay, let me apologize a little bit for all that buzzing sound in the background. That's what happens when you're in the shop, I guess. And at least you didn't hear all the swearing and everything. But so there was the scissor repair, and now how did I come up with that date of 73-74 for this knife? And that again brings us to the owner's manual and pages 133 through 139. The first thing you run into is on my knife, it has the Victoria Officer Suiza tank stamp here on the reverse side. This is only used from 1968 to 74. What they mean by that is that's the official years that it was used, so you will not find it before 1968. You may find it on a few knives after 1974, simply because they're not going to throw away the blade blank simply because it's suddenly 1975. So even if you see this, there's always the chance that you're going to find it on a knife that was made after 1974, maybe 75, maybe 76, who knows, maybe even 3 years later. They would use up the existing stock of blades before they would switch over. So but the official dates run from 68 to 74, and depending on how many blades they had left over, they may show up on 75 or even 76. It depends on the model of knife that they're making. Next up is the reamer and the 5-twisted fluted corkscrew. Well, these do not help us at all. The 5-twisted fluted corkscrew is pre-1981, so you can probably see those all the way up to 1983 or 84. The reamer goes all the way to 85, and what you can basically know is that pre-1961 the reamer was different than what you see there. Before then it was the quarter round reamer. And then in 1961, these reamers started showing up, and then they started replacing them with the sewing eye reamer in 1985. So definitely 1961 to 85 had that reamer. You might find some of the older reamers after 1961, not too many of them, and then this might still show up in 86, 87. The aluminum tweezers were used until 1978. Before that, they had a nickel-silver tweezer. You can see the aluminum here as opposed to the plastic one. The plastic one started showing up in 1978. So we're still looking at most likely the first half of that period of the Victoria's knives. So at least probably in 1978 or so, maybe a little earlier. The stainless steel springs, they started showing up in 1969. They started replacing the blue steel single spring around that time. The new stainless steel spring shows up in 1969, but they were slow to progress into there, so they must have had a lot of scissors left over. So well into the 70s, you could still find some of these blue steel springs. The wire stripper, if you notice, there's this cutting edge on this on your can opener here. That was removed in 1969. Again, it might have still been around in 1970, 71. You would expect that it would eventually start departing the area after that. But what we do know is that in 1969, the new ones show up. So if you see a newer one, you know it's post 1969. If you see this, it's probably pre-1969, but they're still being used a little bit after 1969. And here's another view of that cutting edge. You also see that currently they're using a stainless steel shield. Before that, in pre-1980, it was a nickel silver shield. That does no good on dating this knife for the 70s, but it would help you with other knives. So if you can tell the difference between the nickel silver, which kind of turns a silvery, duller color than the stainless steel, you can then at least know that your knife might be pre-1980 or 1981 or so. Another view of that nickel silver. It's just a little bit duller than the stainless steel would be. It's kind of well, it looks more like silver. That's why it's called nickel silver. And this is the early 5-layer one, and we see the clip blade. We see the saw blade. And we see here on the clip blade, 1973 is when they stopped using the clip blade. It was replaced by the newer pin blade. So this seems to say that it should be before 1973. And then we have the earlier half round tip on the metal saw blade, which was replaced in 1972. So now we're looking at maybe 72, 71 for this knife. And we also had 69 for the other thing. So it's starting to look like this is a pretty earlier knife, maybe is, 68, 69 time period. But then we come up with this, and the patent is no longer appearing on the can opener. And apparently that happened in 1973. So what we're really looking at then is we know that this is 1973 hard date that they started putting this in here. So now we have to assume that maybe this knife is 1973 or later. And that's why I'm thinking it's a transitional knife made sometime around 72 to 74, maybe even as late as 75. It's got the early aluminum tweezers. It's got the later style clip blade, but that's still pre-1973. The early metal file, which is 1972 or earlier, and it had a blue steeled spring, which was 1969 or earlier. Yet the real key was this can opener, 1973. So chances are the knife was made in 1973, maybe 1974. But that's the way you can start dating a Swiss Army knife. You kind of have to look at all the pieces and then start looking at where the different dates fall for all those different pieces. And that will help you figure out about when the knife was made. You'll never get a 100% accurate date, but that's about as close as I could get. So I hope that helped a little bit. As always, thanks for visiting. Feedback is always welcome. Insults are cheerfully ignored. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and ring that bell so you'll know when something new is coming out. Again, thanks for watching.